Brilliant. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Merritt Goff, technical lead for WRC, but I'll be chairing the session today for this workshop, which is actually just going through all of the stochastic weather generation work that we've been doing right across all the regions, and giving an introduction of how we've used them to help with building the regional plans. The agenda for today is that I'll just hand over to Paul Hickey from Rapid, who will just go through an introduction. Then I'm going to turn to Jeff Darch to go through some of the background to all this and why we've undertaken this large amount of work, this body of work right across all the regions. Then we're going to hand over to Steve Wade, just going through the Atkins weather generator. We'll have a quick update from all the regions before heading into the panel Q&A session at 2:10. That's a chance for us all to ask questions and ask the panel questions around the approaches and that have been used in generating these new weather sequences, which is consistent across the various regions. And then I'll try and bring this together in terms of final comments and close. So that's the kind of plan of attack. For those of you familiar with Teams, you'll see at the top bar and next to the people, you've got a chat function, a reactions, and there's actually a Q&A chat function. So if you'd like to ask a question going through today for the session, please use the Q&A chat function, and then we'll try and pick them up either through the various bits of the talks, or we'll collectively bring them together at the final panel Q&A session, Jeff. So thank you all very much. So without further ado, Paul, I'm just going to hand over to you for a few opening words.
There you go, Eric. Thank you. Now with the mute button off, so that's so yeah. Thank you for that opening, Merrick. I would like to start with an apology. I have to leave at past due to a conflicting appointment, but we do have members of the team, notably Hayden, here. Just to explain who I am, my name is Paul Hickey. I'm on assignment into Ofwat from the Environment Agency to lead an organisation called Rapid, which is an alliance between Ofwat, the Environment Agency, and Drinking Water Inspectorate to oversee the programme of strategic schemes. We also have a role in coordinating with the partner regulators the regional planning, and that is important because it's the regional plans and the associated water resource management plans that dictate the need for not just the strategic options, but the interventions both on the supply and demand side. I guess we are in a period of transformation in terms of water resource planning. We've moved from a period of looking at companies looking at risk within their geography and the interventions to manage those risks to the 5 regional planning bodies that you will hear about later on in the agenda. And I think that's really important because it's allowing us to look at infrastructure, for example, that serves multiple companies and also multiple sectors potentially. It's also prompted quite a lot of technical innovation because looking to the future, we know that the past it will be different from the past, and that really is at the heart of what today is about, is how we generate future scenarios given the uncertainties of climate change and other variables. There have been concerns about how the methodology that companies and regional groups have been using. So this is in the interest of transparency. This is an opportunity to go through that and test the logic of those methodologies. In advance of this, we've been doing a lot of work directly with the regional groups to understand that better, and the associated partners like the Met Office Atkins and others who have been supporting this technical work. But really, Merritt, that's all I want to say by way of introduction. This is a way of just sharing what is called some quite complex technical work, but really underpins a lot of the regional strategies and associated WRMPs. Before I close, Hayden, would you like to just introduce yourself, and if there's anything you want to add to that?
Thanks, Paul. Yes, I'm Hayden Johnson, so I lead the gated process within Rapid. So the gated process is the sort of gated funding allowances that the currently 18 strategic options have to pass through in order to, I suppose, unlock certain kind of funding allowances from Ofwat that were set out in the last price review. Now, in going through those gates, we undertake certain technical and progression assessments as well. So I think from the previous gate, there were a number of representations that we received from wider stakeholders on those decisions and what we were looking at and what the regional groups and the solution teams undertook as well. So this is as a result of our response to some of those representations to try and encourage and to set out some of that transparency, like Paul said as well. So and I think the last thing I'll say is that our next gate is coming up next month. No, sorry, this month. We're already in November. So in about 2 weeks, actually. So for wider stakeholders that are on this call as well, there is opportunity in Gate 2 to respond to our decisions, which should be coming out in March next year, following our period of assessment that we're about to undertake as well. So yeah, lots of opportunities to engage, and we do think that is the best way to approach this.
Okay. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Hayden. Jeff, can I now turn to you just to give us all some background around this process and why we've undertaken this work?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Merritt, and good afternoon, everyone. So yeah, as Merritt said, I'm going to give a little bit of background really to kind of how we've got to this position and really set this in the context of considering what are pretty extreme and therefore quite rare drought events. Now, there's been a kind of an evolving analytical approach over the past couple of decades. Paul alluded to this in his opening remarks. I mean, historically, water companies essentially just considered the worst drought that they had on record, and the efforts 20 years ago in water resource planning were really around extending that historical record back in time. So, back to the sort of early part of the 20th century, for example. And then moving forward, we started to look at the potential for using stochastic weather generators and much longer historical rainfall runoff modelling. So using some of that information to run through models. And part of that was looking at, can we identify a 1 in 100-year drought, which could be beyond that worst drought on record. And then more recently, in terms of the plans that were published in 2019, so WRMP 19, and to inform the price review, there was an ask to look at 1 in 200-year droughts. And for that, we did some further work improving weather generators. Companies did work looking at extreme value analysis, EVA, in terms of meteorology at least, to look at how previous droughts actually stacked up in terms of 1 in 200. And there's also work undertaken to look at the narrative of droughts. So how do droughts evolve? How severe do they get? How do they terminate? And then more recently, we started to look at this question of 1 in 500, which is, as I'll explain in a minute, is the kind of the new challenge that we're looking at. And for that, we've taken sort of weather generators to a more advanced level, I think possibly to the sort of most advanced level that we probably will get using that methodology. We're now looking at system return periods rather than meteorological return periods. And there are also some other interesting techniques emerging, for example, around storylines. So looking at how we can kind of describe different evolutions of droughts in a narrative function, but with associated modeling. So that's just a bit of context. I suppose, you know, where did this 1 in 500 year come from? It's a bit kind of slightly esoteric kind of number. I mean, and really, I suppose what we're saying is it's about sort of lowering the risk to a very, very low level. But it was particularly picked up in the National Infrastructure Commission's 2018 document. You can see the front cover of that on the right-hand side, and what that included was essentially an analysis that looked at the cost of a drought event. So that, you know, what would a 1 in 500 an extreme drought actually cost us, and how does that stack up against you know, proactive resilience planning and basically preparing for such an event. And you can see the numbers on the screen there. And I mean, essentially, you know, their conclusion was that it was well worth investing to meet the needs, not just from 1 in 500 drought, but also taking into account climate change and population changes as well. And essentially, the 1 in 500 has then become sort of baked into guidance. So the most recent version of the Water Resource Planning Guideline, the WRPG as it's known, which was published at the end of last year, basically instructed companies to plan for this 1 in 500 or 0.2% annual chance of failure. And really what that means is it is associated with emergency drought order. So these are the most extreme measures that companies can bring in to restrict demand. So things like rotor cuts and standpipes. So essentially what it's saying is companies should, you know, have a supply system that can cope with a 1 in 500 year drought without having to resort to those extreme measures. Now, just a few more sort of specific points and extracts from the guidance. This is from the supplementary guidance on 1 in 500 year droughts that was written to accompany the Water Resource Planning Guideline. And you can see some of the sort of premise of this, talking about levels of resilience beyond drought events that have been experienced historically, and then again another reference to the 1 in 500 year drought, but specifically looking at system response. So it's not necessarily the 1 in 500 year meteorological event. It was actually, you know, targeting what you know, how the system would react to that. So if you like, the experienced event. And there was also, in terms of timing, suggesting that companies should get there as early as possible, but by 2039 at the latest. But there was some recognition, and this has been reinforced by Ofwat more recently, that there may need to be some flexibility in achieving that, particularly where there's disproportionate cost involved. And actually, I think what we're seeing in the emerging plans is that, you know, 1 in 500, the benefits of 1 in 500, we realise once we get some of these strategic options that Paul and Hayden have referred to in, they're huge enablers for resilience as well as other factors. So why are extreme droughts different? Well, you know, we haven't really seen an extreme drought, at least in the UK, in any kind of historical memory, and probably not even in kind of instrumental memory. I mean, we've done quite a lot of work in the east of England, you know, things like the early 1930s, we think was around a 1 in 200 year event in the southwest of our region, the groundwater drought that we had, that people will remember in 1989 to 1992 in parts of our region, was something like a 1 in 200 year event from a meteorological perspective. But actually, you've probably got to go back to something like the Great Tudor Drought in northwest Europe to get an idea of this. And of course, we don't have data, unfortunately, from that period that we can neatly plug into our kind of hydrological models. Interestingly, this year there's been some commentary in Europe, at least, suggesting that the drought in northwest Europe, or you know, even towards Central Europe, has been something of the order of a 1 in 500 year drought. I don't think that's quite true within England. but obviously there's more numbers being crunched on that. So the other point just to sort of recognise here is the guidance also talks about some of the difficulties and uncertainties with these techniques, particularly things like extreme value analysis when you're going out to extreme events, and also issues associated with bias correction. So real recognition that there are some challenges, and talk in the guidance about the importance of testing a range of essentially synthetic droughts and looking at the robustness of the supply system. Now, just to conclude really on some of those kind of technical issues, obviously, as in with any modelling exercise, they depend on the quality of the data that's going in, and obviously for stochastic weather generators, as Stephen will go on to talk about, they are based on observed data, and the length of that record can be a material factor in terms of the underlying driving climate. Bias correction can also be an issue, but there are techniques to remove that, and this is a very familiar topic with anyone who works in the sort of climate modelling space. It's something that's talked a lot about and techniques used within climate change modelling as well. Calculation of return periods, as I've mentioned, the different ways that you can reach a return period estimate, different theoretical distributions of extremes that can be used, and they need to be considered. There's also the issue of scale. So what scale matters here. We've typically from a water company point of view, we'd be looking at the catchment scale or the hydro, the aquifer unit kind of scale. But obviously, when we're looking at transfers between regions, it's important to look at the coincidence of droughts across much larger areas. And of course, there are limits to weather generators, as I mentioned, and I think probably we're getting to the point with the current crop of generators that we're probably taking things as far as we can. And there's some interesting dynamic approaches, particularly associated with the more high resolution climate models that ultimately may replace them. But certainly for now, they are the best tool that we've got for this. So Merrick, I'm going to stop there, and I think we'll have Stephen's presentation next.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. And it's good to map out the kind of history and analytical development of these processes and techniques, because they have emerged over the last couple of decades, haven't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and then there is a tale here in terms of how they've been used. Of course, they've been used a lot internationally as well, and in sort of agricultural kind of applications. So they're not kind of unique to water resources. But.
Yeah, agreed. Steve, I hope. So please, I think this part is really important just to go through. So take your time, and there'll be a question and answer session as well on any points of clarification, everyone. So we'll let Steve go through his presentation and we'll pick up questions afterwards. So over to you, Steve. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Merrick. I hope everyone can see my screen, which I've now shared. So I'm going to give a quick overview of the Stochastics work on the Regional Climate Data Tools project. First of all, we just acknowledge that this work was supported by the regional groups, that includes the water companies and the Environment Agency in Ofwat. We had a steering group made up from those organisations, and also just acknowledge we had quite a large team. We presented some papers and posters recently at the BHS conference, so I'm just acknowledging the support of a wide number of people there, as well as separate peer reviewers. Rob Wilby and Theo Economou worked on the project quite a lot before he moved universities elsewhere in Europe. I'm going to give just a bit of an introduction, and then I'm going to hand over to Lauren Petch. The reason for that is that Lauren is actively still developing the weather generator for the future, or for future use. So we're going to do a joint presentation on this occasion, and we are leaving plenty of time for questions. So this is quite a short overview. I think already, Jeff has given a really excellent sort of context. I was going to refer to some of the same guidance here on 500-year droughts. I think, you know, if we look back to the last round of plans and before, we were a long way off from being that resilient. So, you know, we will need large investments on the demand side and the supply side to reach this by 2039 or before. And, you know, I think that will mean you know, new reservoirs that get through the gate process in the southeast of England. Now, climate models, we're all fairly familiar with climate modelling. In fact, you know, we have used climate models from the Met Office in 5 rounds of plans. So as long as I've been a consultant, we've done sort of climate change impacts assessment as part of the water resource management planning. But actually, stochastic modelling is a bit newer. The industry flirted with stochastic modelling after the 76 drought. There was a Royal Society review of methods, and you know, the Institute of Hydrology and others were looking at introducing stochastics, but it didn't quite catch on. But it has done over the last couple of rounds of industry planning. So you know, tried and tested methods in the academic literature, but still a relatively new thing in our water resource management planning process. So we're gonna just you know, say what we delivered as part of the project. Lauren is going to give an overview of the modelling steps, and then I think we'll have a discussion around some of the issues which come up quite a lot when the work is reviewed. I think that will then set up a bit of a question and answer session after our presentation. So Lauren, I'll control the slides and I'll hand over to you. Just tell me when you want to move on from slide to slide. Lauren.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. Yeah, so basically this is just displaying an overview of what we delivered as part of the Regional Climate Data Tools project. So spatially coherent stochastic daily rainfall and PET series for there was around, I think it was just under 200 locations in total across the country, and that was working out to, I think, at least 40 or 50 locations for each of the regional groups. And then as part of that, there was also the bias corrected regional climate model data for those areas as well. But yeah, I'll be concentrating on the stochastic weather generator bit of the model in these slides. So if we can move on. Yeah, so the core of the model for the weather generator is it's in R, and it's based on a model that was originally developed by in 2012 by Serinaldi and Kilsby, I think. And since then we kind of have applied it over various iterations and made some made some changes and modifications, and for this latest round with the regional climate data tools is probably where we've made the most significant changes in terms of how it works. But essentially it fits generalized linear models to deseasonalized monthly rainfall probability distributions across the numerous rainfall locations, and then looks at the correlation between the rainfall sites in the natural variability of the rainfall, and that's how the spatially coherent data is generated. So as well as the monthly rainfall, it includes a number of teleconnection data, which in this round, as well as the North Atlantic oscillation and the sea surface temperature, we incorporated a number of other teleconnection data sets, and that was part of the reason that it started in 1950 rather than earlier in the 20th century, as had previously been done, and I'll cover that a bit in some later slides. And then a curve fitting approach is applied to the generated stochastic data to account for some of the anomalies. And finally, the daily stochastic rainfall and PET series are generated through resampling from the historic data sets. And yeah, so if you go on to the next slide. So the outputs of all of that are 400 replicates of the 48-year observed period for each of for daily rainfall and PET. And as part of the generation process, we produce many different plots across different metrics and scales to validate the output against the historic. There's a couple of examples there, and just as a note, where we were looking against the historic, we were always looking against the full 20th century record, so not just the 1950s onwards. So in the plots on the lower plots on the right hand side, where you can see the red points, dots on the 1-to-1 red line, that represents events in the observed record that were prior to 1950, so they don't have that corresponding stochastics kind of blue spread against them. And the lower plot on the left is just an example of also some of the other ways we looked at the data in terms of rainfall deficit metrics at sub-regional scale for durations from 3 to 36 months. So that kind of looks at plots the scale of the stochastics against the historic for pre-1950, post-1950, and then looking at the range of that and showing that it falls within the ranges there. So if we move on. And then here's an example of some of the outputs. The plot on the right is meant to be a bit of an animation. I think it's not working on my screen, at least. I don't know if it's working for any of the others, but basically just an example of the scale and pattern of events, in the sense that the stochastics generated droughts comparable and more severe than the historical record. So you could see an example on the right is a 1 in 200 event, roughly, and then on the lower plot you can see where that falls roughly in terms of what the worst historic was in that green vertical line. And then, so yeah, for the next 2 or 3 slides, we've just tried to pick out a few of the topics that, as Stephen said, come up a bit and we thought that people are most likely kind of wanting to talk about. So firstly, the choice of the 1950 to 1997 observed period. So as I said before, this was basically chosen to maximise the availability of good teleconnection and rainfall data. And when we were doing the development phase for the Regional Climate Data Tools project, we did look at the comparison between this. So the comparison between the models with fewer teleconnections data but a longer historical record. And we have also validated all of the outputs against the full 20th century observed record. So we did find that the shorter period had marginally better results and a better fit to the low rainfall, and was still able to show those very extreme low rainfall patterns. Having said that, so it does perform well against those kind of rainfall metric plots, and looking at that, there is you can arguably say that because the data is driven by the static teleconnection data, that it may arguably lead to a kind of a prevalence of similar types of droughts. So for instance, the 1976 drought or 1995 could be a kind of overly represented in that type of drought and led by those teleconnection conditions at the same that were happening then. So another area that Jeff was talking about as well is the difficulty around extreme value analysis and estimating return periods. So do you treat the stochastics as one long series, which we have commonly done? Should it be treated as 400 replicates of 48 years, or can you do something in between? So during the project, we looked at a number of we compared a number of different methods and looked at a number of different distributions for doing extreme value analysis. And the conclusion was that the viable distribution generally provides a pretty good fit and is definitely one of the more practical ones to fit. Whereas over, say, the GEV distribution, which tended to come out a bit better but is more complex to fit. So I was looking at that, and yeah, but that there's a lot of kind of uncertainty around doing this type of extreme value analysis, and there can be lots of uncertainty, especially when you're fitting to a short historical record. It can be quite sensitive to your fitting methods and outliers. So, for example, the plot on the right there is comparing the extreme value analysis distributions for the observed record and the stochastics when treated as one long series, which is the kind of the grey outlined points that go down, and then the vertical line is the stochastics when treated as 400 replicates. So with the worst in each run, there is a kind of 1 in 48 years, and that just shows the kind of uncertainty that is there in the data. So the range there is a range of possibly 1 in 10 to up to the worst historic that it's being represented there. But it can also show that it might not be that easy to see for everyone. The orange point there is the worst observed from pre-1950 and how different that is to the worst observed from the post-1950. And so you're very sensitive to what your minima is there. And so our recommendation is really to handle with care and try and use as many sources as possible to triangulate your evidence there. And also, just as a final point, this was one of the comments from Rob Wilby, who Stephen mentioned at the beginning was one of the people helping advise us. Question around when you're dealing with replicates which are correlated, which ours are because they're based off these teleconnection data. If you're looking at frequency analysis across those replicates, there's a risk that you could be either inflating or reducing the likelihood of your drought. So again, that's just another comment about how there's a lot of uncertainty there, and you've got to kind of deal with it, handle it with care, and yeah. So yeah, finally, the final point is around the regional drought coherence. So this was a separate or slightly separate bit of work we did after developing the weather generator, which was mapping the regional data sets together to allow for some of the multi-regional modelling for some of these big infrastructure projects. And so basically, there's some positive correlation between the regions anyway, because of this teleconnection data, but it is weaker than that seen in the observed. We applied a matching method looking at the correlation between sites where, so each of the regional groups that border each other deliberately have a number of sites which are the same in the data set, and so we looked at the correlation between them and used R to find the best possible match across those for a number of different metrics and across all the years. And from that we came out with a mapping of each of the replicates. So say replicate 1 maps to replicate 10 in a different regional group. And so this led to a higher correlation, although it's still reduced as compared to the observed. So that's what you see in the bar chart on the left. The red bars show the observed correlation. This is for, I think it's the 12 months ending September durations, and as a regional average to a regional average. The gold bars show the correlation that you got if you just did run 1 to run 1, so you're kind of your random correlation, and then the dark blue ones are the improved correlation we got after doing this matching method. And then on the right hand side, this shows the correlation. This is against a different, slightly different spatial scale. So this is looking at the UK CP18, I think river basins or region areas. I can't remember the exact term for them, but it's basically showing that looking at southeast to the northwest, the stochastics does have a lower correlation to the observed, but it's actually better than is seen in the regional climate model correlations, which are meant to be fairly well spatially correlated. So just kind of put that into a bit of context, and we can also see there that the stochastics and the Marius data are both kind of have more data down at the lower end of the scale there, so they're both able to look at the kind of the low, more extreme droughts in that sense. And then on the right hand side, that just shows that basically all of those data sets have a pretty good correlation within an area, so southeast to the Thames region. So I think that was, oh yeah, I'll pass back to Stephen.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. I'm sure we'll get questions on those topics, but just a few kind of reflections. I mean, we did a lot of work on this project in a very short amount of time, but just to sort of take a step back a little bit. I mean, if we look at the stochastics and we look at the other evidence we have from observed data, regional climate models, etc. We've got lots of sources of evidence that show that we can get much more extreme droughts than we've experienced in the last 50 or so years. As well as the stochastics, there's lots of other really important things you need to think about. And what we found in this work is that the interpolation steps to translate point rainfall to catchments, the choice and calibration and validation of hydrological models, and how they perform under very dry conditions are equally as important in the chain of uncertainties. So there's a lot to think about. This is one important step in terms of stochastics, but there's also other things we need to bear in mind. I think the industry has advanced a lot in looking at the system responses to meteorological and hydrological droughts, and I think when you put these stochastic data through models, it is revealing some system sensitivities and vulnerabilities that we just wouldn't understand unless we did this work. So I think that's really good. In my view, we have to admit that droughts, because of the different durations, the spatial extent, and all the other complexities, they're frankly much more complicated than floods. So I think it's a real step forward just that we're testing systems against a wide range of droughts, and I think that's the most important thing, rather than agonizing too much over the perfect 500-year drought definition, although we do get a sense of that from doing systems modeling. And we did learn through the project. I mean, we used the Met Office Hadley Centre gridded climate data. There are still a couple of places in the country where the interpolation of that data is not perfect, and there are some issues. So, basic things around data review are also still important when looking at very low rainfall. Just to pick out a couple of positives, we think the stochastic generator has proven to be a pretty practical tool for the regional groups to use, particularly within their regions. the data have been picked up and used by other communities, including, you know, flood risk community and the hydroecology community. There's a bit of talk about some of the minor adjustments that we make at the end of the model. If we're not entirely happy with the fit, we may make small percentage adjustments in some of the low rainfall. But just to put that in context, that is absolutely nothing compared to the bias correction we have to do with regional climate models. So we really are beginning to split hairs on trying to get the best possible fit with these stochastics, and frankly, the models are doing pretty well. So I think going forward, we expect that there'll be a sort of widening perhaps toolbox that we could use, and we think this tool will still be part of that toolbox. Although there may be some other methods, and each approach has a sort of pros and cons, and it's really good to discuss those and be transparent with the strengths and weaknesses of all of the individual models. Some negatives: we know that for some people, dealing with enormous amounts of data has been problematic, and I don't know if it's a negative or not, but most of the work's been done by a small number of consultancy groups. So I think the methods around drought narratives and different approaches instead of complex modelling, may be of interest to some going forward. So that's all from us.
Okay.
I think we can take questions.
Yeah. Thanks, Laura, and thanks, Steve. I want to give people sufficient time for Q&A, so I'm gonna. We are behind by 10 minutes, but I'm going to leave this open for 10 minutes. Jeff and the other speakers will just try and squeeze a little bit, though we had 10 minutes for a wrap up at the end as well, but I would like to make sure people have time. Derek, I'll turn to you first, please.
Yeah, thanks, Merrick. Derek Stochastic, coming at this, I should say, from the background of a nuclear physicist, okay, who wrote his first Monte Carlo simulation in 1968, and this whole simulation, stochastic simulation, derives from nuclear physics. I must say that what I take to be the observed data points on some of your graphs, I think on slide 6 or slide 5, don't look very good in the extreme tail. And our question really relates to: why are you not simulating the climate data from when the climate change became obvious? Okay, if you look at the NASA data, the climate change is not obvious until perhaps 1980 or so, but since then it's become absolutely obvious. You've missed out 22 of the most climate change affected years in your simulation, and I think this will make a big difference personally to the accuracy of your simulation. And I have not heard a reasonable description of why you don't use 1997 to 2019 or wherever the last validated year is. So could you say why?
Yes, yeah. I mean, these are the kind of issues that we discussed at the beginning of the project, and essentially the stochastics was intended to, deal with, natural variability in a baseline period, and then your climate change assessment is built on top of that to look at future climate change. So for that reason, we did stop short and finished in the 90s. So we were within the kind of current 1981 or 1971 to 2000 is often used as a baseline period in climate change science. So that's the approach we took. We could start integrating both the stochastics and climate change, and it would be a slightly different modelling approach. That could be done, but for this round of plans, you had two steps. One was to understand natural variability, and then to add climate change. So there are two different steps in the water resource management planning process. And there are obviously issues around fitting statistical models to data that might is non-stationary. So the more up to date, if we take data to the present, we're clearly getting into that stage where the time series is non-stationary. and there may be certain aspects of the statistics that fall apart. So I think if you did that approach, you would have to do some sort of detrending, apply the models, and then put the trends back in, and have a sort of more integrated approach to doing both stochastics and climate change. So, you know, we could take that approach. I'd say we discussed it at the beginning of the project, and we decided to stick to this sort of two steps: one, deal with natural variability, and then add climate change afterwards. So decision was made really at the beginning of the project.
Well, I coming back on what, have you ever seen the non-stationarity of the nuclear physics reactions and shielding calculations that people simulate? Have you any experience of that? No,
I'm not,
probably
well,
not.
I'm not a nuclear physicist, no.
No, well, non-stationary data is old hat for simulating in stochastic processes. So that I think is a total red herring. But what I want to say is the climate change allowance in the WRSE water deficit plan is very small compared to the drought, 1 in 500 year drought allowance. The whole thing is dominated by the 1 in 500 year drought resilience. You know, there's a tiny amount for climate change and a massive amount for 1 in 500 year drought resilience. So I think the thing is that to get the climate change and the drought stuff in together, because at the moment the tail is wagging the dog. You know, American will know that we're talking about factors of 10 between the climate change allowance and the 1 in 500 year resilience. Anyway, I'll let somebody else make a quick comment.
Thanks,
Sorry.
Derek.
Sorry, I'll lower it.
That's fine. That's fine. Anyone else? We have some more time if you want to raise any questions in this bit. John? John, if you're talking, you might be on mute, or it might just be me, I can't hear.
There we go. You can see me and hear me, I hope.
Yeah, we can.
Well, Derek has just been talking about the recent period, which is not included in your 47 years. I want to talk a bit about the earlier period, which includes the 1920-21 drought and the 33-34 drought and the 43-44 drought, which were three droughts that were all more severe system-wise than the 1976 drought was, quite a lot more severe. And the reason that they were more severe is that they extended longer into the autumn. They were, 1934, for instance, continued right up to early November, whereas the 1976 drought stopped in late September, which is a big difference. So can you explain, how is that? That clearly those were different types of droughts that were more system severe for London supplies. So how do you take that into account in what you've done?
Well, as we explained, we did split the data into after and before 1950, but we do test the model, and it's got some benefits in fitting a model to one data set and then proving it works looking at another data set, which is what we do. So we show the performance of the stochastics against data from 1903 to 1949. And we look at that compared to with metrics that vary from sort of 3-month rainfall deficits through to 36-month rainfall deficits, and we showed that the stochastics perform they perform well against those older droughts as well as the droughts that the model was fitted to. So we think we've got that that has been covered. And we have when we decided to go to this shorter training period, we did quite a lot of work comparing the former stochastic model, which was from the early 20th century to the present, or to 1997, and the model we've come up with performs similarly well for those longer duration droughts. So we test for it, and there's no evidence to say that it doesn't fit the 1903 to 49 period. If they look at those metrics, it can reproduce droughts as severe and more severe as those droughts in the earlier 20th century.
Is that more severe in terms of the lack of rainfall during, say, an 8-month period, or is it more severe in terms of duration? So, in other words, if London supplies are very sensitive to these droughts that go on and on and on into the autumn, have you checked whether your generated 20,000 years contains similarly 3 in 100 years of droughts that are these very long droughts? Have you looked at drought duration from that perspective?
Well, I mean, the approach we've taken is we've looked at drought deficits over 30 months, 36 months, and we've looked at those deficits ending September, ending different months around the year. So there's automatically about 20 to 30 metrics that are calculated when we go through the process, and if there's anything that looks odd, we'll see it, and we'll find that the stochastics is not matching those droughts, and we haven't really seen any evidence of that it fails to produce challenging long droughts. There are definitely challenging long droughts in the stochastic data set.
Okay, thanks, Steve. John, is there anything else, or?
I'm not sure, Derek. Are we getting on to conversion of the rainfall into runoff, or is that are you covering that later?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, we'll be just covering that later, John. We're going to do an overview from each of the regions on what they've done, so you get a sense of what that is.
Right. So you are, because as I see it, part of the difficulty of the stochastic flow generation is, once you've got the rainfall, is converting it to runoff, especially in chalky catchments where the groundwater has such a big influence. And I think that is probably as big a potential source of error in the stochastic data. But so, and is that something you're covering in detail later on, or not?
So in detail, we're doing an overview in the next session, John, and I'm just wondering whether we pick some of this up in the panel session as well, after the overview. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Is there any other questions on this bit now? Okay. Well, Steve and Lauren, thank you very much for just doing the overview.
Thanks.
I think we'll go into the next bit now, which will just be an overview. I'm going to take it slightly out of order, Jeff, if that's all right. So Mark, yep. If we do Mark, Miranda, Neil, and I'll finish up in terms of the overview of the Southeast. And then we'll go into the panel session. So we are running about 10 minutes behind, but that's fine. I think I'd rather make sure we're able to ask some questions. So Mark, could you go through an overview of what you then did for the East?
Yep, no problem. So I'm Mark Sampson. So I'm the Supply Forecast Manager at Anglian Water, and this is covering the WRE region. So prior to sort of how we use the data, it's worth just providing a quick overview of some of the inner workings to the WRE simulator and how that converts the Atkins stochastics data into a storage and a flow. So we have what's called LPMs within the WRE simulator, and this can be divided into two sections. So you have the SWAC model, which is a simplified lump version of the distributed 4R model that the EA uses to provide recharge into their groundwater models, and this is calibrated on surface water gauges and recharge flows. And then we also have the lump parameter model itself, which similarly is a simplification of an EA groundwater model. So that's usually done in ModFlow, and this is calibrated using naturalized water balance from the regional groundwater models. It's also worth mentioning that the timing and magnitude of impacts from the abstractions can vary. So abstractions from groundwater can be delayed or impact watercourses differently depending on proximity to watercourses. So the reason these more detailed models were simplified into more lump models was to provide faster runtimes, to ensure that we could use all the Atkins data, but also we wanted to improve the spatial and temporal representation of abstractions within the WRE region. And then just on groundwater yield, so yield curves were derived for each source or group of sources within the WRE simulator, and these were in either average, maximum, or drought yield. Come on to that in the next slide in a minute. But the LPM storage percentiles attributed to 5 categories, which then determine the yield. So if you skip over onto the next slide, please, Jeff. Yeah, so you have 5 different yield storage curves. So you have a average, maximum, and drought. So the maximum is your blue area, your average is the yellow sort of band in the middle, and your severe drought yield is in red. And the areas in between the different categories are just interpolations between them. So the LPM storage percentiles are provided, and so the LPM storages come from the recharge model. That provides you with an LPM storage. Depending on what percentile that storage is will then depend on which category that falls into, and then that will depend on what yield is applied to the groundwater sources in the WRE simulator. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is quite a useful flow diagram which summarizes how that all works in practice. So on your left-hand box outside of the simulator, you have what I've just described. So you've got your Atkins data, your PET rainfall that goes into your SWAC-mod recharge model. That provides a total recharge, which goes into your lump parameter model, your groundwater model, and this is converted to a natural base flow for each subcatchment. And then that combines with your surface runoff, which also comes from your SWAC-mod model to provide your total naturalized flow per subcatchment. This also provides the groundwater naturalized state or storage that I described earlier as well. Within the simulator itself, you've got groundwater components or groups of groundwater. So the abstractions within each subcatchment is allocated, and the model has all the abstraction license constraints and yield constraints associated with them. These calculate the abstraction impacts per subcatchment and also updates what we call a forward order book, a future abstraction impact. So this is where abstractions where have an impact on watercourses, but they're delayed by potentially days or weeks. So these is to make sure the forward order book is to make sure these abstractions are accounted for in the correct time step to incorporate those delays. And then the impacts, so the impacts in that time step are all captured within the forward order book, and that then influences the flow in each subcatchment, and then equally the groundwater state. That changes as a result, and you have this sort of feedback mechanism which changes the yields for the groundwater and provides that new constraint up at the top. And then on the right hand box, you know, all this influences then what is provided as base flow for the surface water component, and the amount of water that can be abstracted from the surface water is dependent on obviously the flow in the river, and yeah, there's some interplay there with company levels of service, which are captured, identified within reservoir control curves. And that basically provides the water availability for abstraction. And then on the final slide, yeah, that just summarizes the data that goes into the simulator. So we've used all 19,200 years of the Atkins stochastics. We've also used the perturbed climate change Atkins stochastics as well to calculate climate change impact in the future. It is worth noting that the WRE simulator, it doesn't provide a deployable output as such. So the 1 in 500 year or other return period events are basically identified by looking at levels of service failures on the key reservoirs within the region, and then option portfolios are identified to resolve the deficits using predefined metrics. And I think that was the last slide.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mark. Miranda, can I just turn to you now just to go through what you've done?
Miranda, do you want me to share slides?
Yes, please.
Yeah, no problem at all. Just bring them up.
Yeah, very much a high level overview because there's an awful lot of work described here. Yeah, next slide. So for most zones for water resources, I'm Miranda Foster representing Water Resources North. And in Water Resources North, we've not taken the same approach as other, as say Water Resources West, Water Resources East. Each company has done their own modelling, and we've amalgamated the results to get the regional, because we've each got our different models. We haven't got an overall simulator model for the whole region. So we've used the system response for our individual zones mostly. We've generally treated the stochastics as a long time series, but we've also looked at how what happens if you treat them as individual series. And I can show you a graph of that later. So we've got the deployable output for each resource zone in the North region, and we've used the Atkins stochastics. And so it's they're coherent regionally, but not nationally. Next slide, please. So it's at a very high level. So we have used across Water Resources North, we've used rainfall runoff modelling. We've used these 19,200 years of stochastic data, and that necessitates a very different approach to using our historic data. Historic data, we can be really familiar with each individual drought. We know how different parts of our system respond. So with stochastics, it's been a very high level. We've each used our models, our simulation models, and we have looked at using inverse ranking as well as EVA techniques to look at the 1 in 500 year system response. So now talking specifically about Yorkshire water, we've also investigated what happens if you use, the differences really between using EVA and the just inverse ranking. So as Mark described, taking the 38th worst year, which is equivalent to 1 in 500. Could you show the next slide, please, Jeff? I'm afraid this hasn't come out very clearly on this, but this is showing the relationship between return period and minimum modelled reservoir stock. So this is just for the Yorkshire region. So the grey lines are the different stochastic. So these are the 400 different stochastic variates. So you can see there's a huge range. There's a lot of uncertainty, but you know, that's the purpose of the stochastics, to give us a large range of droughts that we haven't experienced before. When we just can carry out EVA analysis on a historic series, you get the sort of like the pink asterisks, so the higher line that you might be able to see. So those pink asterisks show those, you know, are 1 in 500, and this shows what our minimum modelled stocks would be at 1 in 500 for the historic. When we use inverse ranking, so of the system response, so for us it's the minimum modelled stocks, you get the plus at the bottom, so that's quite a lot lower. And then if we use the stochastics as a whole, but perform EVA analyses, so extreme value analyses, on either the entire series or on all 400 replicates, and take the median of those, that those answers are actually quite similar. So those are the black circles and the red crosses. So we found that there's not much difference depending on whether you treat the whole stochastic series as one long series or 400 replicates when you do EVA analyses on them. But there is a difference if you just for the Yorkshire data anyway, if you just take the inverse ranking and just take the 38th worst year. And yeah, the reasons for that we're not quite sure at the moment, but I think it's probably some of the points that have already been raised about the difference that, you know, it's the whole process of moving from the stochastic rainfall and PET data to the flow data to the modelled response, and so that's what we're starting to look at now. And so we've, you know, it's just talking about what we've done in Yorkshire, and this slide really is just a summary of the different resource zones in Water Resources North and how we have calculated the deployable output at the 1 in 500 level. And then, you know, you can see we have so we've calculated, I think as Merrick explained earlier, we've calculated it at 1 in 500. We then applied the climate change, and for us anyway, the climate change has been has resulted in quite a large reduction in deployable output, maybe more than Merrick's had. But the 1 in 500 has been the major change compared to using the historical data. But then I guess that's the point of it, to explore differences. And for us, especially in Yorkshire, the 1950 to 97 period includes by far our worst drought, and it includes a drought, our 95-96 drought. It includes a drought that not just spread over the winter, but, you know, into the next year. So it's our only 2-season drought. So for us, we have plenty of very severe droughts in that period. I think our initial thoughts are that maybe that it makes the stochastics far drier than our historic data does, but that's not to say that they're not, that they're wrong really. You know, we're having this year the drought we've had, well, we'll see if it continues, but we've had drier inflows this year than we've had in for some periods in our historic record. So it could be just that our historic is catching up with the stochastics. We won't know until we've had a lot more data. But yeah, for us, the 95-96 includes a drought over, you know, a winter drought. So even though we've only had that, you know, that's the only example we've had in our historic period since the 1890s. That's got a return period on average of 1 in 50 years, so it's quite extreme. But it appears less so in the stochastic series. And that's all for me.
Okay, thank you, Miranda. Neil, can I just turn to you now, just to take us through an overview of how it was applied over in WRW?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Merrick. Jeff, are you able to share my slides, please?
Yep, that's fine.
Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah.
Afternoon, everyone. So I'm Neil Upton. I'm Water Resources Technical Lead at UU, but also the Supply Workstream Lead for Water Resources West. So this is a Water Resource West presentation. I've got just 4 slides. The first one is about our approach. The second one is some of the key benefits. And then I've just got a couple of slides on some of the challenges that we've had and how we've overcome them. So in terms of approach, our DO method is the full system response method as described by Jeff earlier on. So we're looking at the level of demand that we can meet without exceeding certain levels of service. For example, 1 in 500 emergency drought orders or standpipes. When we do our DO runs, we produce that graph at the bottom. So we've got a plot of deployable output versus return period for each metric. So we're not just getting single numbers, we're getting that whole relationship between deployable output and return period. Really important point in moving to stochastics is simulation length. So we've all gone from 50, 100 years of historical data, and we've jumped all the way up to 19,200 years, which is obviously a huge step. So within Water Resource West, we all generally prefer to try and run that whole data set. We typically find it a bit easier to make the computers work than do lots of human steps, making subsets and things. But there are some examples where we've had to use subsets. So Severn Trent, where they assess climate change, they cut it down from 19,200 years to about 5,000 years. And at UU, we do some drought level optimization with a smaller subset, but generally we try to do as much as possible. The way that we do that is by introducing what we call rapid simulators. So these are essentially just faster water resources models. So within Water Resource West, every big resource zone that we've got has now got a Pioneer model. So that's one of these faster models, and we've got a Pioneer model for every resource zone that's big enough to warrant it. There are a few smaller resource zones where we can just still use Aquator, which can run the full data set quite easily. Okay, next slide, please. So this slide just sets out some of the benefits. In a minute, I will go on to some of the challenges that we've had, but I think it's really important to point out that, you know, while there are some challenges, while there are some difficulties, we've come a long way through using stochastics. So the first point I want to make was maybe a bit different to some of the other points we've been talking about. We've been talking a lot about these severe and extreme droughts, but through using stochastics, what we found is that we also get a lot more information about these more frequent, lesser droughts where we're implementing temporary use bans and drought permits. So with historical records in the UU time series, for example, we'd have 4 or maybe 5 droughts that would lead to temporary use bans. And that's not great for generating statistics, but now we've got lots and lots and lots of these lesser droughts as well. So we get a lot better statistics purely just through the volume of data. And as we've talked about quite a lot, we do get these droughts to simulate now, these severe droughts, extreme droughts that we don't have in historical records. We've got 38 of these with a 1 in 500 year severity or worse in the stochastic data set. And what this means is that we can do these simulations, we can understand what happens to our system during severe events. We've come to learn that these severe events are all very different to each other. And some are very short, acute events, some are more long, drawn-out events. Key change compared to WRMP19. So we were using stochastics in WRMP19 as well. But the big difference this time is we've got this regional data set where we're able to do simulations across boundaries, and this is really important because we're obviously really involved in water trading and transfers in our region. Final point, we've talked already a bit about integrating stochastics and climate change, and Stephen talked about the 2-step process. It seems like in the future that's the way we'll go, but I would like to point out that this time it's been really convenient to have this 2-step approach, because what that means is we can just pick up lots and lots of different climate change projections and then match those with our stochastics and really easily look at the spread that we get from climate change. Okay, so I've got a couple of slides on overcoming challenges. So first one, program. From a water resource modelling perspective, we've really got our work cut out now. We've got stochastics, 1 in 500 resilience, UK CP18 climate change, thousands of projections, regional planning, trading, adaptive planning. So we're really pushing ourselves now, and the stochastics, the fact that we're trying to run these big data sets is a really important factor in that. The way that we try and overcome that, as I've already mentioned, is through using faster models. But yeah, going forward, and as we've got a few regulators on the call, a bit of a plea that we need to make sure we need enough time, leave enough time in the future to deal with this. Second point, sense checking results. So anyone that's done a lot of water resource modelling will understand that it's really important to check the failures and make sure that it makes sense. So in the past, we would use these historical records with the English and Welsh DO, and we'd have looked at that one failure, whether it be in 1976 or 1995 or another well-known drought year, and really check that. These days, we've essentially got 38 1 in 500 year failures. So within Water Resource West, we've invested a lot of time in creating checking tools and techniques to make sure that all those failures make sense. And what we found is that was a really valuable process, and it led to a lot of model development. Another point which we've talked about quite a lot is drought sampling. So if you do comparison of this 48-year record against a longer record, what you find in some parts of our region, mainly within Severn Trent, is that the frequency of droughts is a bit higher, and that does lead to some differences in results. For other areas, for example, UU, we didn't really pick up on that, at least on the northwest as a whole. Another point that we've talked about quite a bit is linking to other regions. So we've got some big transfers going out of the northwest and Water Resources West, and also coming in, for example, Kielder potentially. And we've got these regional data sets that aren't coherent, but we've already talked about the mapping that we use there. Final slide. So spatial extent. So what we're creating for quite a few different data sets within the Northwest and Water Resource West, we found that there can be a difference in the deployable output results that we get as we move between these data sets. And it seems like there is quite a strong trade-off between local accuracy and geographical extent. And at the moment, it feels like we've got that balance about right, but it's maybe something to think about in the future if we move more towards a national data set. River D catchment. So River D is a really important catchment in Water Resources West. 3 of the 4 companies in the region abstract from it. Natural Resources Wales are also really involved in the catchment because it's a managed, regulated catchment. And as an example of what happened when we introduced stochastics, we found here that the stochastics were actually quite a bit drier. So similar to what Miranda was saying, introducing the stochastics led to a worse resilience. The historical data were a bit wetter. When we really dug into that, we found that some of the reasons weren't actually linked to the introduction of stochastics. They were more to do with the rainfall runoff modelling. And that's something we're working on really closely with NRW, and we're looking to further improve for the next water resource plan. The final point I wanted to make is that at UU, every time we've done a WRMP now, we've introduced a new stochastic data set, and we just need to be a bit careful that we don't undermine stakeholder confidence and keep moving from data set to data set. So I think every time we do a WRMP, we need to think really carefully about the pros and cons of moving to a new data set. Okay, that's everything.
Brilliant. Thanks, Neil. Jeff, can you just put the slides up for myself, please? So what I plan to do is I'll just run through what we've done in the Southeast, and then I'm just going to help turn to Doug just to kind of give a bit of an example what he's done with Affinity in terms of the approach.
Yeah, let me just bring them up.
Okay, thank you. And then following the my overview, which is only a few slides, we'll go into the kind of panel session, so we can go through and ask some more questions. The kind of overview slide for us was really just to highlight in the Southeast, there's 6 water companies, and going into this regional plan, working with the companies, they were all at different stages of evolution in terms of what water resource models, simulation models they had. Certainly, they were all over different platforms and using different weather sequences, predominantly historic, but some had moved on to stochastic weather sequences, but some hadn't. So one of the kind of key things for us at the beginning of this project was to try and drive some consistency. So we ended up generating the overall regional simulation model. That was a big commission, and the generation of a coherent set of stochastic weather sequences, which you heard Steve talk around earlier. That was important because at least it starts giving us consistency of approach within the southeast, and the generation of the regional simulation model actually had to be broken down into several smaller components, which I'll talk about on the next slides. Having said that, sorry, Jeff, one final thing. Having generated the stochastic weather sequences, the companies then take that up to go through their various models, and sometimes even through some of the groundwater models that the agency would have to help produce some temporal inputs series so they can undertake their deployable output assessments, and then those come back up into our overall investment modeling approach that we have. So lots and lots of coordination and modeling that went on and was undertaken at the very beginning of this whole regional project some 2 years ago. Next slide, please, Jeff. So in terms of developing that regional system simulation model, we ended up moving, I think, pretty much like everyone else now, to the PyWare modeling platform. It allows for much faster, rapid simulation of the water resource systems, and it also gave us a consistent platform on how we can then start joining some of these sub-models up together to look at movement of water across the region. And that was really important. What was also important, though, is as we developed these models, so the companies would then look at the sub-models for the region and make sure that they were went through a calibration validation stage so they could represent their systems correctly. And that was really important to make sure we had accuracy within the models that we were using. So we ended up with that water resource simulation models made up of kind of 17 sub-models encompassing the whole 37 water resource zones across the southeast of England. And they were developed and calibrated at the sub-regional level, but it does allow us the flexibility to start looking at them in conjunction with each other. Jeff, if you can go to the next one. So several phases of work for us. We ended up with developing the overall regional of these submodels. The companies took them away, made sure they were calibrated and validated at all the submodels, and then we went through a kind of a final sign-off process with the companies. The developed stochastic data sets you heard Steve talk around were then used by the companies. That was a new approach for 3 of them, so Southeast Water, Portsmouth and SES. But it meant that there was an update of these stochastic data sets, and possibly to Neil's point as well, another set of data sets for Thames, Affinity and Southern. But at least now we had a consistent set of data sets going across the southeast. We looked at developing a groundwater screening tool just to help identify where we need to use the groundwater models to help provide temporal data sets and where that wasn't necessary. And where they could use some of the more traditional techniques to estimate the deployable outputs of some of the sources. That's something that the companies went on and looked at. Companies would also then look and review their rainfall runoff modelling approaches, and where necessary, some of those were updated, make sure they could have some good calibration and validation of those stream flows. So all of this input data going through the simulation models, going through the rainfall runoff models, then allows us to come back and develop a system simulation analysis for the southeast. So very much the same as Neil was talking around, where we could understand what the 1 in 500 year deployable outputs impacts were for those events, And we also used the technique to look at the climate change impacts right across the region. So that's how we also looked at the climate change impacts for each of the systems. This approach was also adopted for some of the key SROs as well, because it was really important to understand and have consistency and coherence about what those schemes could do in terms of improvements to deployable output, particularly when introduced into the region. And I know there's been a lot of additional work done with the STT, for example, where they're looking at the conjunctive operation of that SRO across Water Resource Western and WRC. That is a broad approach. Now, John, what I've asked is, Doug, can I turn to you just to kind of give a flavour for how Affinity then took these data sets and applied it on your system, please?
Yeah, hi, Merrick. So I don't have any slides or anything, but just I guess Affinity is quite useful because all of our surface water sources are either license or bulk agreement constrained, so we don't have any stochastics required for those. On the groundwater sources, we have a number of sources that are hydrogeologically constrained, so their capability varies according to rainfall and drought severity. So what we got is that we have 3 regional indicator boreholes that we have lumped parameter models for. So they're fairly similar to rainfall runoff models, but they basically predict groundwater levels based on rainfall and PET inputs. And what we did basically is simulate groundwater levels for the full stochastic sequence. And obviously did all of the calibrations and checks as you've shown for the sort of surface water to make sure that the stochastic data matches the historic record and is consistent with it. And so we take those groundwater levels and we plug those into our system simulation model. And what that does is that tells us what the 7-day rolling and 30-day rolling capability is for all of our sources that are constrained by groundwater level. So it's basically the same thing, but with a groundwater lump parameter model rather than a rainfall runoff model on surface water.
Okay, thank you. And Peter, are you able just to give us a brief overview of how you've applied this for the Thames area, please?
Yep, so we've got groundwater dominated and surface water dominated zones. So we've taken the stochastics and we've run them through lump parameter groundwater models to generate groundwater sort of time series that we put into the Piware model, and we've also run them through our existing hydrological models. So we've used our water resources model from times gone by, which contains hydrological models within it. We've used that model as a hydrological model, and then have used it. That one is too slow to be used as a water resources model for stochastics, but can be used as a hydrological model for stochastics. So we've used it as a hydrological model and have put those flows into the Piware model and generated deployable outputs that way.
Okay, thank you, Peter.
Cheers.
So that kind of hopefully just gives you an overview. Appreciate that there's a lot more detail that we could go into. But I'm conscious of time, but I would like to now just move Jeff into the panel session where we can open floor up for more questions, if that's okay.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, and I mean, just for sort of joining us on the panel, we've got Stephen Wade, who presented earlier, Doug Hunt, who was just on, who's Affinity's WMP program director, and also Joe Osborne, who's the industry consultancy manager at the Met Office. But equally, if there are questions for any of our immediate previous speakers, then now's the time to raise them as well. So really it's over to attendees now. If you've got a question, please either raise your hand or add it to the Q&A section, and we'll look to pick that up. Okay, so John, we'll come to you first, and then we'll go to you, Kelvin.
Okay, well, Well, first of all, thank you, Merrick, and all of you for doing all that. It has actually been a very interesting overview, but it is only an overview, and there's obviously a massive amount of detail underlying all this work. So my question really is, when is it going to be available for inspection? I'm presuming that there will be reports coming from each region on the approach adopted, and similar to the reports that were produced for WRMP 19. Atkins produced some reports on the various stages of stochastic work. When are those going to be available? Are they going to be available? And when will actual data be available? And I would be quite keen to get hold of some of the 20,000 year time series so that I can see for myself what's been going on. And is there going to be a system to enable those to be downloaded or to be listed, and so we can select what we want to download, that kind of thing?
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, it's a good question. Merrick, I don't know if you want to pick up specifically for WRC. I'm happy to answer for WRE, but
yeah. So, John, we will be publishing the reports on the regional system simulation model, and that will be out shortly. Certainly when the plans come out, so you'll have that information. On the data sets, I'm pretty sure they will be available. I'm going to check with the companies though, John, first of all, before I give a final yes or no, if that's okay. But yeah.
Yeah,
I really think for transparency they need to be available,
yeah,
so that we can, it's really important.
I've noted, John. No.
Yeah, it's similar for WRE, and I'm sure similar for other regions. The package of information is coming out in a couple of weeks' time, and yeah, data sets, we won't publish them by default on our website, but yeah, certainly happy to pick up individual conversations for those who are interested and have the capability of running it. So thank you, John. Kelvin, I'll come to you next, please.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Yeah, I think my first word is complexity. So I think this is a really complex piece of work. I don't underestimate it, but I do think it is definitely needed, and this new stochastic approach is really welcomed by me, to be truthful. Something needs to change dramatically in the way we manage our water and value our water, so I welcome that, and seems to me this is sort of quite an international piece of work, so I think that's good news for the UK. However, I'm really concerned in what I've heard said about we're applying what I'm going to call, and you might not like the term, but the broken CAMS models to the output from the stochastic, if I get the right pronunciation, because quite clearly in East Anglia, the CAMS process has let us down, and that's why we're failing the environment and failing our rivers, to be truthful. And I'm really concerned that we're going to be applying, rules that have allowed over abstraction and over licensing to what could be a good model. So, I think we need to go away and have a look at that. And I've got a piece of work ongoing with Mark to review really some of those 3-year drought, long-term droughts that we had in the 90s, to see what the model is actually showing now in terms of the Fen Reservoir, because at the moment, several of us believe we've got a bit of a high bar to reach to, get a sustainable output out of the reservoir, to be truthful. So I think that's probably all I've got. I'm happy about the new approach, but I'm concerned that we're applying a fundamental flaw to the new approach.
Yeah, thanks, Kelvin. Yeah, and understood, where you're coming from, and I think that the piece of work that you referred to with Mark, looking at the performance of the regional simulator, but also some of the more detailed models that we've got, will be useful, and obviously welcome your ongoing input into that. So yeah, looking forward to further conversations on that. Thank you. John, we'll come back to you if that's okay next. John, can't hear or see you.
Sorry.
That's okay. Got you now. Yeah.
I think it was speaking about the Northwest, that there was a reference to droughts not making sense. Can Could you explain a bit more what was meant by that, please?
Yeah, John, thanks. I'll ask Neil to come back on that, if that's okay. Neil, are you okay to pick that one up?
Yeah, I'm not. What do you? So, but I'm not making sense. Do you mean the drought sampling, John? Then, do you mean the comparisons?
I think it was you were referring to the 38 droughts that are more severe system-wise to 1 in 500. And you thought that some of them didn't seem to be sensible. Could you explain what you were finding there?
That's a really good point. Now, it's not that the droughts weren't sensible. What we need to be really careful about is that the water resources model's response to those droughts isn't sensible. So our water resources models have been built over a long period of time, 10, 15 years, and they've been brought up through historical drought sequences. So they're all used to simulating 1976, 84, 95, 96. So where we had to be really careful is that when we introduced these really extreme droughts into these models, we didn't just put the data into the model, press go, and then accept the answer. We had to do quite a lot of work to make sure that those droughts were behaving sensibly, that our system was responding sensibly to those droughts. That's what I mean, really. You can imagine that the impact of a 1 in 500 year event is much more severe than a 1976 or a. And what we're really doing as well, when we're calculating this system response DR, what we're really doing is we're simulating restrictions, we're simulating the implementation of standpipes. So we need to make sure that we're doing a good job of that. It's something new from what we've done in the past, and that's what we've spent a lot of time on, certainly in our region, developing our water resources models to do a good job of.
Okay, I think I'm understanding that, but could you give some examples of in what way your simulation models were throwing out things that didn't look sensible? Was that in terms of temporary use bands and that kind of thing? Yeah,
not so much temporary use bands, because temporary use ban happens quite early on in the process. So even in a very, very, very severe event, a temporary use ban is level 2. Drought level 2, it happens quite early. So generally the system's working quite well at that point. I'm talking about when we're into the point where we'd start to apply standpipes. So UU, for example, our implementation point for standpipes is when reservoirs get down to dead water. So we're talking about a system that's really under pressure. And it's just that the water resources models haven't simulated that type of event, those type of conditions before we've got to this point. So it's just making sure that what they do when they get down to that point is sensible. So how's the water supplied to towns and cities in the model? How's the water moved around the system when there's just a lot less water in the system than there would be during a historical type drought that the models have been really trained on? Okay. So yeah, it's just really making clear that a big chunk of what we've had to do with these stochastics is make the water resources models do a good job of simulating those severe events. But that it doesn't just stop when Atkins have produced the data or we've done the rainfall runoff modelling. The water resources modelling element's really important as well.
Great.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Neil. That's very comprehensive. Right, have we got any more questions? Any more questions? This is your chance to ask anyone who's presented something. So John, yeah, happy for you to ask another one, but equally, yeah, others, please do raise your hand, or if you don't want to speak, put it into the Q&A and I'll read it out. But John, over to you. And you're on mute, John. Yeah.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm in danger of hogging it here. You made a reference, Neil made a reference just now to standpipes coming in at dead storage. That does raise the whole issue of what you consider the emergency storage to be. And this is something that I've raised before in responses to various WRMPs, that there's a lot of inconsistency across the country between what different water companies are assuming. Has there been any attempt made to come up with a sort of a common policy on that, so that one is comparing like with like?
Yeah, it's a good point, John. I think they can even vary within companies depending on the nature of the reservoir. I'm not aware. I mean, it's the kind of thing that Acquia or someone like that could look at. I'm not aware that has been done. It's certainly something we can take away. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on that.
And also, certainly from a guidance perspective, it's something that a company needs to think about and agree with the board, etc. Yeah, it is very company specific as well, and just yeah, it has to be really. I think it would be quite difficult to just come up with something that worked across every company, every resource zone. When you dig into it, it's quite complicated.
Yeah. Okay. But yeah, John, it's one of those things that we can sort of put into the Acquia space as well, I think. So. Okay. Derek, I think you've got your hand up next.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, we seem to be dominating this. What question I have is that I get the feeling that different zone area groupings are at different stages in actually finalizing how they actually use the data from the 1 in 500. You know, I seem to have got a side remark by Neil that, you know, WRMP 29 will be a time when they'll be improving. Given that water transfers really depend on different regional groupings being roughly at the same stage in applying the stochastics, are we going to see a proper comparison for WRMP 24 for the water transfers which are in the strategic resource options? Or are we going to find that, oh, we're not quite ready to do this until 2029? That's the question. Will you be ready?
Yeah, thanks, Derek. Yeah, it's a good question. Doug, I wonder if you're still online, whether you'd like to pick that one up, given the cross-boundary issues that you're facing into.
Well, I mean, for Affinity, the main transfer scheme we're looking at is a water recycling scheme, so it's not constrained by drought. I mean, well, it is to a certain extent, but that's to do with some storage requirements. I think. I mean, so if you take and I'm not working on the Severn Thames transfer specifically, but that's to do with the hydrology of the River Severn and availability there. As far as I'm aware, and Neil may be able to add more than this, that is definitely the same level of stochastics and the same level as modelling as the WRSC areas, and it's a combined model. So that's captured. In terms of the releases from things like Vyrnwy to support it, that's about United Utilities confirming that water is available, and I believe they've done that as required. I think some of the refinement that Neil's talking about, if you look at the different systems, so UU system, I've worked on it previously, and it is very complicated compared to, say, the London system. So I'm not really surprised that they've got some bits and pieces left to do. You know, even Anglian's only got 2 reservoirs, 2 big ones, so they're relatively straightforward. In UU, they're having to balance a hell of a lot of reservoirs across each other. So I think that's more what Neil was talking about. I mean, in essence,
yeah, I'd say the opposite is almost true, because this planning round, we've all got this regional stochastic data set created by Atkins using the same approach. I'd say that, like, more than ever, there's huge consistency now. The consistency we've got now has never really existed before, I would say.
And I was about to come on to that. So, you know, what basically everyone's taken the data, they run it through whatever rainfall, runoff or groundwater model. We've all done that consistently. And actually, for, you know, when we've been looking at the Anglian to Affinity transfer, for example, we've been able to do a conjunctive use assessment of, you know, what happens if Affinity takes the water from the South Lincolnshire reservoirs versus Anglian just taking it. And this stochastic data set has allowed us to do that in a consistent, coherent manner. So yeah, no, it's all done. There is always going to be refinement for some companies, but in terms of a consistent approach across all the regions, this is the first time we've been able to do that, and it's been done in plenty of time for these plans. Yeah.
Thanks, Doug.
Sorry, thank you.
Thanks, Neil, as well. Right, any more questions? I'm just going to check the Q&A because I can't see anything in there. I've got a couple of questions in here now. Great. So we've got a couple from Rob Brown. So first one, just wondering how treating 48-year stochastic sequences as individual segments allows estimation of, for example, 400 estimates of 200 or 500-year return period droughts. Yeah, so this is sort of based on the EVA. Miranda, do you want to come back on that, given that you've done some work on that front?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I guess similar to return period analysis on floods, it's just fitting distribution to only 48 years. So yeah, when we look at flood return periods, we often get return periods that are far larger than the size of the data set. So yeah, we've done that for Yorkshire. We've done that for 400 times 48, of the 48-year long sequences. So there is a lot of uncertainty in it. But by taking the median, we hope to get rid of some of that uncertainty, and are quite comforted by the fact that it's quite similar when you do the same analysis to the 19,000 years. It could be coincidence, but I think it is. It's good that they are similar when you take the median. Those large range.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Miranda. And a second question from Rob, one for Doug. Do you have separate lumped groundwater models for each borehole? And if so, how do you relate them to each other? And does your modelling tie into the regional groundwater models? So Doug, if you're happy to pick that one up, please.
Yeah, so no, what we do is we have indicator boreholes that give you the for each of the sort of 3 aquifer areas that we've got. They indicate the groundwater levels within those aquifers generally, and then we have a series of analysis that take those groundwater levels and turn those into output capabilities for each of the individual boreholes. So it is all done on a coherent basis. It because it's using the different indicator boreholes, it also puts in the sort of variability you see in the response of the aquifer. So we have so the Lily Bottom will respond differently to Elsenham and that sort of thing. So we have the 3 indicator boreholes. They've each got a lump parameter model. It uses the aerial geographically consistent data sets of the stochastics, and so we get if you like, a proper representation of the drought across our patch. That gets translated using various forms of analysis and algorithms according to the manual of source yields approach. So there's a lot of detailed stuff that's been done way back that relates the DO from individual boreholes to regional groundwater levels, and we've used that for those individual sources.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Doug. It's a similar approach to what is used in WRE. There are some subtle differences, but very similar. Thank you, Doug. So that was the end of the Q&A questions. Just looking at hands. So John, to come back to you, if that's okay.
Miraculously, I've switched on both my microphone and my TV set this time. Coming back to the question I asked right at the beginning about availability of information, I'm just thinking, you're due to publish the reports in 11 days' time. Is it going to be possible to get really fast response to information requests? Because we've got this, I know it's a 14-week consultation period, but that's going to quickly run away. And I know that I'm going to be wanting to put in some quite heavy data requests. I mean, is there a mechanism for them to be dealt with sort of quickly so that we can get this stuff back, within days rather than waiting, 30 days until after you put the question in?
Yeah, no, I can understand that, John. Merrick, do you want to pick that one up for WRC?
Yeah, John, we based on what we saw in the emerging plan, we put a process in place. So not only have the companies got their own processes going for data requests, but we've also got a process in for WRC so we can coordinate between companies and the region, depending on where the data request comes in. So we've got processes, we've got them set up ready, so we're more prepped than we were for the emerging plan. So yeah, I'm hoping we can turn them around quicker than we did before, particularly if they're going to be of a similar type to the data request we had in the emerging plan.
Okay, thank you. And so, I mean, on this specific area of the stochastic data, would those data requests be going into the regional groupings or to the water companies?
John, we'll make sure that whichever way they go, we're trying to coordinate across the company, so it will get picked up.
Okay.
So hopefully that'll give you some comfort.
Okay.
Yeah, but I mean, John, if you know what it is you're likely to need, I know you might want to see the reports, but yeah, obviously, yeah, give us a heads up ASAP, and we can put it on the to-do list. So that'd be appreciated. Good. All right. I can't see any more hands, and neither any more questions, unless I'm missing anything. Merrick, can you see anything?
No, I can't. I think that brings us nicely to the end. So I think a couple of bits from me from summing up. Hayden, I'm going to just turn to you for any reflections as well. That's okay. But first of all, I'd like to just say thank you to everyone who's attended today. It's been really good. John, thank you very much for your questions. Otherwise, there've been a few pauses during this conference. But no, it's really appreciated, and thank you for the level of interaction as well. Thank you for the speakers for just kind of going through and preparing the bits and answering the questions that we've gone through. I think it's been enormously helpful that time. And it's good to see that we're going back to some of the Tudor droughts, Jeff, that you referenced earlier, which is always comforting. So I'm gonna slowly draw it to close. But Hayden, is there any other bits you just want to pick up on?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Merrick. Firstly, to reiterate your thanks to the regional groups and the water companies here as well. We are aware of how busy this period is with your regional plans, WRMPs and Rapids Gate 2 submissions going on as well. So it's really appreciated that you were able to do this still and put together such detailed kind of presentations. So and hopefully that is welcomed by the sort of wider groups that we have on today as well. I suppose an interesting reflection from Rapid. So it was mentioned earlier about consistency across regional groups, and I suppose it's worth mentioning that sort of consistency or national picture is something that the regulators are looking at as well. So for an example, within Rapid, we're funding a national model. Well, there's been a couple of national models actually. We've been looking at the latest of which, and we've just published our phase 2 report on as well. And this is a much simplified but national picture of the water resource supply system across the UK. So this sort of national picture, coherent droughts across the whole of England and parts of Wales as well, it is something that we are also looking at from our side as well. So from regulators across to water companies, it's an area that I think everyone wants to move into, and is trying to really achieve the same goal on this as well. So yeah, a little of reflection there on what we're doing on our side. But yeah, I mean, otherwise, yeah, we very much look forward to seeing your Gate 2 submissions come through in the next kind of week or so. So yeah, thanks everyone.
Okay, thank you, Hayden. So just so everyone's aware, the kind of the rough timetable is, and John, you alluded to it as well. So we've got the Gate 2 submissions middle of November. I think 14th is the exact date. Hopefully the draft water resource management plans and regional plans get out on the 14th as well. And then we go into a 14-week consultation period for people to look at all this. So I appreciate there's a lot going on in this space at at that one time, but really looking forward back to consultation responses, and then there'll be a publication of statement of responses by the companies, because we follow really the formal WRMP process then in May next year. So it is going to be a busy time, but again, once again, thank you very much for attending today. And I think we're going to end up circulating slides, Jeff, in the future on this, so we'll circulate them around to everyone who's attended. Okay, thank you very much, and I'll draw it to a close. Bye bye.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you.